You have never shared a single second with anyone, not your closest friend, not the person asleep beside you right now. Every clock you have ever stood near, a wrist, a heartbeat, a wall clock in a shared kitchen, has been ticking at a very slightly different rate than yours for reasons physics can measure precisely. It isn't a metaphor. Gravity slows clocks down. Motion slows them further. Two people standing a few feet apart at slightly different heights are aging at measurably different speeds this instant, whether they notice or not. Which means every together you have ever felt, every moment you assumed was shared equally, was actually two private clocks running close but never quite matched. Lie still. Let the room go quiet. This is where that gap actually comes from, and what it means for the people you have already lost time with. The clock you never question. You have almost certainly never once in your entire life questioned whether your watch and someone else's watch are measuring the same thing. Not the same reading. You know, two clocks can disagree because one is running slow or set wrong or hasn't been wound. That kind of disagreement feels like a mechanical failure, something a repair could fix. What you have never questioned is something underneath that, whether, once you correct for all mechanical error, once you have the two most perfect clocks ever built, side by side, freshly synchronized, they would then simply agree forever, ticking through time together at exactly the same rate. It feels like the most obvious assumption a person could make. A second is a second. It is a fixed unit, the same everywhere, ticking away underneath all of us at one universal rate, the way a metronome keeps the same tempo whether or not anyone happens to be listening to it. Your whole understanding of shared experience rests on this assumption without you ever having to state it. When you say you grew up alongside a sibling, or grew old alongside a partner, or shared a particular hour with a friend, you are quietly assuming that the passage of time itself was the one truly neutral, truly shared thing running underneath the two of you the entire time, the stage on which your separate lives happen to unfold together. That assumption is false, and it has been known to be false with total certainty for over a century. It is not a matter of philosophical interpretation, the way some of the stranger consequences of physics remain genuinely disputed. This one has been measured directly, repeatedly, with instruments precise enough to catch differences far smaller than anything you could ever perceive with your own senses. Two clocks started in perfect agreement will drift apart if they experience different conditions, different speeds, different heights above the ground, different strengths of gravity, and they will drift apart in a way that is not a malfunction. It is not the clocks failing to measure time correctly. It is time itself behaving differently in two different places for two different observers simultaneously. This documentary is going to walk through exactly why that happens, and then it is going to ask you to sit with something most people never let themselves fully absorb. If time genuinely passes at different rates for different observers, depending on where they are and how they are moving, then the people closest to you, the ones you have shared a room with, a bed with, a life with, have never actually been keeping the same pace as you, not metaphorically, physically. Their clock and yours have been running at very slightly different speeds this entire time, for reasons built directly into the structure of the universe. Start with the part that is easiest to accept because it involves something you already intuitively understand: speed. Move fast enough and time itself slows down for you relative to someone who stayed still. This was one of the first and strangest consequences to fall out of the theory of relativity, and it does not describe some abstract mathematical bookkeeping trick. It describes something that has been tested directly, using real clocks, flown on real airplanes, compared afterward to identical clocks that stayed on the ground. The clocks that traveled came back reading a very slightly earlier time than the clocks that stayed behind, not because they broke, because less time actually passed for them, exactly as the equations predicted, down to fractions of a second calculated in advance and confirmed afterward. This effect, called time dilation, grows dramatically at speeds close to the speed of light and becomes vanishingly small, though never zero, at ordinary human speeds. A person on a long flight experiences a genuine, measurable, if microscopic, difference in elapsed time compared to a person who stayed home. It is real. It has been measured. And it means that two people who part ways and later reunite have not, in the strictest physical sense, aged by exactly the same amount, even if the difference is too small for any human being to ever notice without a laboratory-grade clock. That is only the first half of the story, and by itself it might feel like a curiosity, easily dismissed as irrelevant to ordinary life, since almost nobody travels close enough to light speed for it to matter. But there is a second cause of this same effect, one that requires no extraordinary speed at all, one that is happening to you and everyone around you constantly, right now, without any travel required whatsoever. It comes not from motion, but from something far more mundane, how close you happen to be standing to the center of the earth. That is where we go next. 2 clocks, 1 room, different times. In a laboratory, physicists have taken 2 clocks of extraordinary precision, clocks accurate enough to neither gain nor lose a single second over the age of the universe, and placed one of them a single foot higher than the other. Just a foot. Roughly the height difference between a clock sitting on a low shelf and one sitting on a slightly higher one, in the same room breathing the same air, separated by a gap you could cover with 2 stacked hands. The higher clock ran faster, not by an amount your eyes could ever detect, and not by an amount that would matter for anything in ordinary life, but it ran faster measurably, consistently, exactly matching what the equations of general relativity predicted before the experiment was ever performed. Gravity, it turns out, does not just pull on objects. It slows down time itself, and it does so more strongly the closer you are to the source of that gravity, the deeper into a gravitational well you happen to be standing. This is not a strange side effect of some obscure corner of physics. It is a direct, central consequence of general relativity, the same theory that describes the orbits of planets, the bending of starlight around massive objects, and the existence of black holes. Mass and energy curve the fabric of spacetime around them, and that curvature does not only bend the paths objects travel through space, it bends the flow of time itself. Closer to a massive object in a stronger gravitational field, clocks run measurably slower than clocks farther away in a weaker field. This is called gravitational time dilation, and unlike the effect of speed, it requires no travel at all. It only requires existing at a particular distance from a particular amount of mass. Consider what this means for something as ordinary as your own house. A clock on the top floor of a building is, this very moment, ticking very slightly faster than an identical clock in the basement, simply because it sits a little farther from the center of the Earth in a very slightly weaker portion of Earth's gravitational field. The difference is almost inconceivably small for a single floor, vastly smaller than anything you could ever perceive across an ordinary human lifetime, but it is not zero and it is not hypothetical. It has been measured directly using the same kind of experiment described above, and it holds exactly, precisely, wherever it has been tested. Now scale this up. This effect is why the satellites that make GPS navigation possible have to carry clocks specifically engineered to compensate for gravitational time dilation. Those satellites sit far above the surface of the Earth, in a significantly weaker gravitational field than anything on the ground, and their clocks genuinely tick faster than clocks on the surface as a direct result. Left uncorrected, this drift would introduce navigational errors of several miles within a single day, not because the satellite clocks are malfunctioning, but because they are correctly measuring a version of time that is running at a different rate than the version of time experienced by someone standing on a sidewalk far below. This is worth letting sit for a moment because it is easy to hear. GPS satellites need a correction for relativity and file it away as a piece of engineering trivia rather than what it actually is. Direct, everyday, technological proof that time does not pass at the same rate everywhere. It passes faster in weaker gravity and slower in stronger gravity as a basic built-in feature of how the universe is structured. Not an approximation, not a rounding error, but an actual physical fact about the nature of time itself, one that an entire global navigation system has to account for continuously in order to function. Bring this back down to human scale, and something quietly strange emerges. A person who spends their life at higher altitude in a mountain town, say, rather than a coastal city, is, across an entire lifetime, experiencing a very slightly weaker gravitational field than someone who spends their life near sea level. Over the course of many decades, this produces a real, physically measurable, if genuinely tiny, difference in how much time has elapsed for each of them. Not a difference in how they feel or how quickly they age biologically in any way you could detect by looking at them. A literal physical difference in the amount of time that has passed for their body, their cells, the ticking of every process inside them, compared to someone who spent that same span of years standing closer to the center of the Earth. This means two people born on the same day, who lived their entire lives in different places at different elevations, have not lived through the exact same amount of time, even if every calendar they ever consulted told them otherwise. Their calendars measured days and years, human constructs, useful approximations built for coordination, not physical measurements of the actual flow of time experienced by each individual body. The real physical time each of them lived through was, in a strict and measurable sense, slightly different, shaped by the specific gravitational conditions each of them happened to spend their life inside. This raises the question this documentary is going to spend the rest of its runtime sitting with carefully. If this is true even for two strangers who never meet, separated by nothing more than elevation, what does it mean for the people who actually share your life? The ones who stand in the same room as you, sleep in the same bed, sit across the same table, and whom you have always, without ever quite stating it, assumed were moving through time exactly alongside you. To answer that properly, we need to look at the most direct, most dramatic version of this effect ever actually measured on a living human being, someone who left Earth, spent time in a very different gravitational and physical situation, and came back home younger than he would have been had he simply stayed. That is where we go next, the astronaut who came back younger. There is a real person this applies to, not a thought experiment. Astronauts who spend extended time aboard orbiting spacecraft experience both of the effects described so far at once, pulling in opposite directions, and the actual measured outcome depends on which effect wins. On one hand, an astronaut in low orbit is moving extremely fast relative to someone standing on the ground, fast enough that velocity-based time dilation becomes genuinely significant, slowing their clock relative to Earth's. On the other hand, they are also farther from the center of the Earth than someone on the surface, in a slightly weaker gravitational field, which speeds their clock up relative to Earth's for the gravitational reasons described in the last chapter. For astronauts in low Earth orbit, where spacecraft travel very fast but remain relatively close to the planet, the speed effect dominates. The net result, measured directly using extraordinarily precise atomic clocks carried aboard spacecraft and compared against identical clocks left on the ground, is that astronauts who spend extended periods in orbit return to Earth having aged very slightly less than they would have if they had simply stayed home. The most famous documented case involved a cosmonaut who spent an extended period aboard an orbiting space station, accumulating enough time in orbit that when he returned to Earth, he had aged a measurable fraction of a second less than he would have aged had he never left. A small amount by any ordinary measure, a fraction too small to notice in any practical sense, nowhere near enough to affect his appearance, his health, or how his body felt. But it was not a rounding error, and it was not a theoretical prediction left unconfirmed. It was measured directly, using clocks precise enough to register the difference, and the measured value matched the prediction from the equations with remarkable accuracy. Sit with what actually happened there for a moment, because the plain fact of it is stranger than it first sounds. A specific human being left Earth, spent time in a specific physical situation, high speed, reduced gravity, and came back to a planet where slightly more time had passed for everyone who stayed than had passed for him. He did not travel into the future in any dramatic science fiction sense. He simply experienced less elapsed time than the people who remained on the ground, in a way that is now permanently, physically true of him, recorded in the measured difference between his clock and theirs. If he had a twin who stayed behind, that twin would now be, in the strictest physical sense, very slightly older than him, not because of anything either of them did wrong, or any illness, or any difference in how their bodies aged biologically, but because they spent that specific stretch of time in genuinely different physical conditions, and time itself does not pass at a fixed, universal rate across different conditions. This scenario has a name in physics, the twin paradox, and it is often introduced as an abstract puzzle, a strange implication of relativity meant to test your intuition rather than describe anything that actually happens. It is not abstract. It has been measured directly in real spacecraft with real clocks, and the astronaut described above is a real person, currently, measurably, physically younger than he would otherwise have been, by an amount smaller than you could ever notice but larger than zero, recorded precisely by instruments built specifically to catch a difference exactly this small. Here is the quiet, unsettling generalization this points toward, and it is the one this documentary has been building toward from its very first sentence. If a difference this small, a matter of speed and altitude sustained over months, produces a real, measurable, permanent difference in elapsed time between two people, then the same basic mechanism is operating right now between you and everyone you have ever known all the time at a much smaller scale for much smaller reasons. How fast you happen to be moving relative to them, how far above the ground you each happen to be standing at any given moment of your shared life. You have never been standing at exactly the same distance from the center of the earth as anyone else. You have never been moving at exactly the same speed as anyone else, in exactly the same direction, for the entire duration of any relationship you have ever had. Which means, in the strictest sense the physics is able to define, You have never been experiencing time at exactly the same rate as any other person you have ever shared a life with. Not once, not for a single instant. This does not mean your relationships have been an illusion, or that the closeness you have felt with the people in your life was somehow false. It means something narrower and in its own way stranger, that sharing a moment with another person was never quite the perfectly synchronized experience your intuition assumed it was. It was always, underneath the felt sense of togetherness, two separate clocks, running close enough that the difference never registered, but never actually identical, never perfectly matched the entire time. What would it actually take, then, for two people to genuinely share the exact same passage of time, not approximately, not close enough to ignore, but exactly? That question turns out to have a precise physical answer, and it reveals something about what togetherness has actually meant all along at a level deeper than anyone usually stops to examine. What together actually requires. If time dilation depends on speed and gravitational position, then the physics gives a precise, almost mathematical answer to a question that usually only gets asked poetically. What does it actually mean, at the deepest physical level, for two people to be together? The answer is more demanding than it first sounds. For two observers to experience exactly the same rate of elapsed time, not approximately the same, but exactly with zero measurable difference, they would need to be moving at exactly the same speed in exactly the same direction, and situated at exactly the same distance from every significant source of gravity nearby for the entire duration in question. Any difference in any of those conditions, however small, produces a real, if often immeasurably tiny, difference in how much time each of them experiences. This means true, perfect synchronization of experienced time is not something most relationships ever achieve, even for a moment. Two people sitting on the same couch are already technically at very slightly different distances from the center of the earth, if one is sitting slightly higher than the other, or leaning forward while the other leans back. Two people walking side by side down a street are moving at very slightly different speeds, in very slightly different directions, if only because human bodies do not move in perfectly matched straight lines. The gap this produces is so small it is meaningless for any practical purpose, smaller, by many orders of magnitude, than anything a human nervous system could register. But it is not zero. It has never been zero. Perfect temporal togetherness, in the strict physical sense the equations define, may be something that has essentially never actually happened between any two people in the entire history of the species. Not because people haven't been close enough, but because true zero-difference synchronization requires a precision of position and motion that ordinary life simply does not provide. What actual human closeness has always relied on instead is something more modest, and in its own way more remarkable. Not perfect synchronization, but proximity close enough that the resulting difference in elapsed time is too small for any human being across an entire lifetime to ever notice or be meaningfully affected by. This is worth being precise about because it reframes what closeness has actually been doing physically all along. Being near someone living in the same house, sharing the same city, spending years within a few feet of each other was never achieving perfect temporal unity. It was achieving smallness of drift. The clocks were never identical. They were simply kept close enough for long enough that the accumulated difference between them stayed small enough to be functionally invisible. This is a genuinely different picture of what shared time has been, compared to the intuitive one most people carry without examining it. The intuitive picture treats time as a single river that everyone floats down together, side by side at the same pace forever, unless something dramatic, death, distance, the passage of years apart, separates people from the shared current. The physical picture is different. There was never a single shared current. There have only ever been countless separate clocks, each running at its own rate, determined by its own speed and position, occasionally kept close enough to each other that their drift stayed small enough to feel, from the inside, like unity. There is something almost tender in this reframing once you sit with it rather than resist it. Closeness on this account was never a passive fact, a shared river you simply happened to be floating in together. It was, in a small but real physical sense, an ongoing, active achievement, staying near enough to someone in space and in motion that your two separate, always slightly different clocks never drifted far enough apart to matter. Every year you spent living near someone you loved was a year spent, in a very literal physical sense, keeping your clock close to theirs, not identical, never identical, but close. And this reframing carries a harder implication too, one this documentary is not going to soften. Every period of separation, every year spent apart, at different elevations, moving at different speeds, living different physical lives, was a period during which your clock and theirs were allowed to drift a little further from each other than they otherwise would have. The size of that drift for any ordinary human separation remains almost inconceivably small. Nothing about ordinary distance and time apart produces a difference anyone could ever detect without laboratory instruments built specifically to catch it. But it is not nothing. It is a real, physical, permanent difference, however microscopic, in how much time each of you has actually lived through, compared to how much you would have lived through had you stayed close. This is where the physics stops being an abstract curiosity about GPS satellites and orbiting cosmonauts, and starts becoming something closer to the emotional center this documentary has been moving toward. Because if closeness is what keeps two clocks from drifting apart, then distance, any separation, including the final permanent kind, is what allows that drift to begin and never stop. That is where we need to go next, the distance that was never zero. Think of a specific separation from your own life, not necessarily the heaviest one, just any ordinary instance of distance. A period living in a different city than someone you loved, a long work trip, the years of friendship spent apart before circling back together. During that time, you likely thought of the separation the way most people do, as an interruption in an otherwise continuous, shared timeline. You picture reunion as a kind of return, picking back up on the same shared thread, as though the distance had simply paused something that would resume, unaltered, once you were close again. The physics complicates that picture in a very specific way. During any period of separation, any difference in altitude, in speed, in the strength of the gravitational field each of you happened to be standing in, your two clocks were not paused. They were both still running, both still ticking forward, but at very slightly different rates from each other, accumulating a real, if microscopic, difference in elapsed time that does not reset upon reunion. When you return to someone after time apart, you are not returning to a paused, waiting version of the shared timeline you left. You are two people whose separate clocks have each continued running the entire time, now brought back into proximity, with a small, permanent, physically real gap between them that did not exist in that exact form before the separation began. For any ordinary human separation, this gap remains far too small to ever detect, and this documentary is not asking you to feel it, or grieve it, or treat it as a meaningful loss in any practical sense. What it is asking you to notice is the shape of the idea underneath the number, because the shape turns out to matter more than the size. Reunion was never truly a resumption of an unbroken shared present. It was always the reapproach of two separate, continuously running clocks, whose exact relationship to each other had been quietly, permanently altered by whatever distance came between them, however briefly, however small the resulting gap turned out to be. This becomes considerably less abstract once you apply it to the most extreme, most permanent form distance can take. Consider someone you have lost, someone whose life ended while yours continued. In the ordinary way of thinking about this, their time simply stopped while yours kept going, and the distance between you is total, infinite, unbridgeable, a total absence of shared time from that point forward. That is true in the sense that matters most. They are not accumulating new moments, and you are. But there is a stranger, quieter layer underneath that plain fact, one this documentary has been building toward across every chapter so far. Every moment you did share with them, every year spent living near them, at a particular altitude, moving at particular speeds, occupying particular positions relative to each other and to the Earth's gravity, was a period during which your two clocks, though never perfectly identical, were kept genuinely, measurably close. That closeness was real. It was not a comforting fiction laid over an indifferent physical reality. It was, in the strictest sense the physics can define, an actual physical achievement. Two clocks kept near enough to each other for years that their inevitable drift stayed small enough to be functionally invisible, close enough to feel correctly like unity. What ended when they died was the ongoing process of maintaining that closeness, the continued active keeping near that had, for as long as it lasted, kept your two clocks running close together. What did not unhappen, what the physics does not take back, is every single moment during which that closeness genuinely existed. The years you spent near them were not a story you are only now realizing was always slightly false. They were real synchronization, real closeness, real shared time, exactly as close as two separate, always slightly different clocks are physically capable of getting. The ending of that closeness does not retroactively undo the fact that it was, for as long as it lasted, genuinely, measurably real. This is a different kind of comfort than the one offered by pretending the distance was never there at all, and it is worth being honest about which kind this documentary is actually offering. It is not claiming that loss doesn't matter, or that the ending of shared time is somehow not a real ending. It is claiming something more specific, that the shared time which did occur was not a lesser, approximate version of some perfect synchronization that never actually existed anywhere, for anyone, in the whole history of human closeness. It was, by the actual physical standard the universe operates on, as close to perfect as closeness has ever gotten for any two people who have ever lived. The astronaut's twin waiting on the ground and the astronaut himself, orbiting far above, even they, separated by real speed and real altitude for real months, remained close enough that the resulting gap between their clocks came out to a fraction of a second. If that counts as close, and by any physical standard it does, then whatever closeness you shared with anyone you have loved, standing in the same room, breathing the same air, was closer than that. It was about as close as two separate observers in this universe are ever able to get. There's a harder question hiding underneath this one, and it deserves its own careful chapter before this documentary can responsibly close. Does any of this actually matter, given how impossibly small these differences are? Is this documentary building an elaborate emotional structure on top of a number too tiny to mean anything at all? That question is worth taking seriously, rather than rushing past, because the honest answer changes what everything said so far is actually worth. Does the smallness matter? It is worth pausing here and being completely honest about the numbers, because a documentary that lets you believe these effects are larger than they actually are in service of a more dramatic story would be trading honesty for effect, and that trade isn't one this documentary is willing to make. The gravitational time dilation between a clock on your floor and a clock on a shelf above it amounts to a difference measured in parts per quadrillion. Across an entire 80-year human lifetime, the difference in elapsed time between two people who spent that time at different floors of the same building would come out to a gap of a tiny fraction of a second, far smaller than the blink of an eye, smaller than anything any biological process in your body could ever register, smaller than the margin of error in almost anything else you might measure about a human life. The astronaut who returned from orbit measurably younger than his twin experienced a gap of a fraction of a second, accumulated over months spent moving at extraordinary speed, specifically chosen to maximize the effect. Ordinary human separations, a work trip, a few years living in different cities, an entire lifetime spent at different altitudes, produce gaps dramatically smaller than that. So here is the honest question: does something this small deserve the emotional weight this documentary has been placing on it? There are two ways to answer that, and both are worth holding at once rather than picking one and discarding the other. The first answer is the deflationary one, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than buried. In any practical sense, for your relationships, your grief, your daily life, this effect is too small to matter. It will never be the reason a relationship feels distant, never the actual cause of any real separation you experience, never something you could detect, measure, or be meaningfully affected by without laboratory equipment built for exactly this purpose. If you were looking for a scientific principle to explain why closeness with another person feels imperfect, or why reunion never quite recaptures what came before, gravitational and velocity time dilation is not where that imperfection actually comes from. That imperfection has far more mundane, far more significant causes: memory, change, the ordinary difficulty of two separate minds trying to understand each other, and this documentary has no interest in suggesting otherwise, or in letting the physics discussed here substitute for those more honest, more significant explanations. The second answer is different, and it is the one this documentary actually wants to leave you with, precisely because it does not require the numbers to be large in order to matter. What the smallness of these numbers actually demonstrates is not that the effect is unimportant. It demonstrates something more interesting, that even the most ordinary, most physically unremarkable form of closeness two people can share sitting in the same room, at nearly the same height, moving at nearly the same speed, already achieves a level of temporal synchronization so precise that dedicated physics experiments have to work extraordinarily hard to detect any gap at all. The smallness of the number is not evidence that closeness doesn't matter physically. It is evidence of exactly how good ordinary human closeness already is physically, at the one thing this documentary has been arguing it quietly does: keeping two separate clocks close together. Put differently, the size of the number was never really the point. The point was the structure underneath the number. That shared time was never a single, seamless, given fact about being near someone. It was always at the most basic physical level, an achievement, small, automatic, unnoticed, but real, performed continuously by every pair of people who have ever spent time close to each other. The fact that the achievement is so effective that it produces gaps too small to ever notice is not a reason to dismiss it. It is closer to the opposite, a reason to notice that something has been quietly, constantly working at a physical level every single time you have ever simply been near someone you cared about. This documentary is not going to overstate that as some hidden mechanism secretly responsible for the felt warmth of closeness. That warmth has its own causes, psychological and biological, that have nothing to do with atomic clocks or general relativity. But it is going to suggest, honestly, that there is something worth sitting with in the fact that even the coldest, most mathematically precise description available of what it means for two people to share time agrees, in its own quiet way, with what closeness has always felt like from the inside. Not a given, not automatic, not something that simply happens by default, but something achieved continuously by staying near. With the honesty of this chapter in place, there is room now to return to the harder, more personal question this documentary opened with. What does it actually mean to lose someone, once you understand what closeness was physically doing all along while it lasted, where grief and physics meet? There is a specific, ordinary moment that happens after losing someone, one that rarely gets named directly because it feels too small to mention. The moment you notice a clock, a wall clock in their kitchen, still keeping time in an empty house, a watch stopped or still running, found among their things, the strange, quiet wrongness of time continuing to move forward indifferently in a world that no longer contains them. Most people experience that wrongness as a kind of betrayal, the universe simply carrying on unbothered as if nothing had happened. This documentary wants to offer a different way of holding that same observation, built directly on everything covered so far without pretending it removes the wrongness entirely. For as long as you were close to that person, sharing a home, a city, a table, a bed, your clock and theirs were, in the fullest physical sense available, kept close together. Not identical, nothing ever achieves that, but close, genuinely, measurably close, in exactly the way the astronaut and his twin were close, in exactly the way any two people standing near each other on this planet are close. That closeness was not a story you told yourself. It was a real, ongoing physical relationship between two clocks maintained day after day by nothing more complicated than staying near. What their death changed was not that relationship's past, it changed its future. The active, ongoing process of keeping two clocks near each other stopped because one of the two clocks stopped accumulating new time entirely. But every single moment during which that closeness existed, every ordinary morning, every shared dinner, every quiet, unremarkable hour spent simply occupying the same space remains permanently exactly as physically real as it ever was. The universe does not go back and revise the years you spent close to someone simply because the closeness eventually ended. It cannot. Physics does not work that way. What happened happened and stays happened at its own fixed place in the history of both your clocks, unerased by anything that came after. This offers something narrower than comfort in the usual sense, and it is worth being precise about what it actually is. It is not a claim that the person continues on somewhere, still ticking, still accumulating time you could someday rejoin. This documentary has made no such claim and will not make it now. What it offers is smaller and for that reason more trustworthy. A way of understanding that the years of closeness you shared were not diminished retroactively by how they ended. They were, for as long as they lasted, an actual physical achievement two clocks kept near, exactly as close as this universe allows any two clocks to get, and that achievement does not require the relationship to continue in order to remain true. It was true while it was happening, it stays true now. There's a specific kind of question that grief tends to generate, one that rarely gets a satisfying answer from anywhere. Did the time really count if it ended? Was the closeness real if it didn't last? This documentary cannot answer the emotional weight behind that question, no physics can, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But it can answer the narrower physical version of the same question, and the answer is unambiguous. Yes, the time counted. Every bit of it, closeness, measured the only way physics knows how to measure it, as the smallness of the gap between two clocks, does not require permanence in order to have been genuine. It only requires having actually happened close enough for however long it lasted, and it did happen. That much this documentary can say with complete confidence is not in question at all. What remains is a harder practical matter, one this documentary has been circling since the very first chapter. If perfect synchronization was never actually achievable, and closeness was always this quiet, ongoing, physical labor of staying near, what does that suggest about how to actually spend the time you have left with the people still near you now? Learning to live close. There's a piece of practical, almost embarrassingly literal advice hiding inside everything covered so far, and it is worth stating plainly before moving to the larger scales this documentary still has left to cover. If closeness at the most basic physical level is a matter of staying near, same room, same height, same slow, unremarkable pace of daily life, then proximity itself, ordinary and unglamorous as it sounds, is doing real physical work every time you choose it. This is not a claim that distance is dangerous, or that time apart from people you love is something to be avoided out of some misplaced physical anxiety. The gaps involved are, as the last few chapters were careful to establish, far too small to matter for any relationship, any grief, any real decision about how to live. Nobody should organize their life around minimizing gravitational time dilation. That would be a strange and ultimately pointless response to what this documentary has been describing. What is worth taking from this instead is something more like a shift in attention than a change in behavior. Ordinary closeness, sitting in the same room as someone, walking at the same pace, spending an unremarkable evening near them doing nothing of any apparent significance, is usually treated as the background of a relationship, the plain, uneventful time that happens between the moments that actually seem to matter, the milestones, the conversations, the events worth remembering afterward. This documentary has been quietly arguing, across every chapter so far, for a different way of weighting that background time. It is not empty. It is not merely the gap between the moments that count. At the most basic physical level available, it is the thing that counts, the actual ongoing mechanism by which two separate lives stay synchronized with each other, however imperfectly, for as long as it lasts. There's a version of this that applies directly to how a person might think about an ordinary evening spent near someone they love, doing nothing memorable at all. That evening is not a placeholder, waiting for something more significant to happen. It is at the level physics actually operates on, indistinguishable in kind from any more dramatic moment of connection. Both are simply instances of two clocks kept close, running together as closely as this universe permits. The dishes washed together in silence, the unremarkable drive home. The quiet hour before either of you falls asleep. None of it is secondary to the moments that feel more significant. All of it is the same basic physical event, repeated patiently over years. This reframing will not change how any particular evening feels while it is happening. It is not offered as a mood or a mindfulness exercise or a reason to feel guilty about ordinary time that passed without being appreciated enough. It is offered as a fact, quietly sitting underneath the emotional experience of closeness, available to notice or not, changing nothing about how the evening unfolds, but perhaps changing slightly how it gets remembered afterward, not as filler, but as exactly the kind of time that closeness, in the strictest physical sense the universe recognizes, has always actually been made of. Having looked closely at how this plays out at the human scale, a room, a floor, an ordinary evening, it is worth widening the lens considerably to look at what happens to time dilation in the most extreme physical conditions the universe contains. Conditions where this same effect, so vanishingly small in ordinary life, becomes large enough to completely reshape what simultaneous even means. That takes us to the strangest clocks in the known universe, the ones sitting near the edge of a black hole, the places where time nearly stops. Everything discussed so far involved gravitational fields weak enough that the resulting time dilation stayed almost immeasurably small, fractions of a second, accumulated over months or years, detectable only with instruments built specifically for the purpose. There is a place in the universe where this same effect, driven by exactly the same physics, becomes so extreme that it stops being subtle at all. That place is the boundary of a black hole, and looking closely at what happens there reveals something important about what has been true, quietly, at every smaller scale covered so far. A black hole is, at its simplest physical description, a region where gravity has become strong enough that nothing, not even light, can escape from within a certain boundary, the event horizon. As you approach that boundary, gravitational time dilation, the same effect responsible for a clock on a shelf running faster than a clock on the floor, grows without limit. A clock held near the event horizon, compared to a clock held far away in relatively flat, ordinary space, ticks slower and slower, the closer it gets, approaching a complete stop as it approaches the horizon itself. This produces one of the strangest, most carefully verified predictions in all of physics. From the perspective of a distant observer watching something fall toward a black hole, that object never actually appears to cross the event horizon at all. Its light reaches the distant observer more and more slowly, more and more redshifted as it approaches the boundary, stretching out toward an infinite delay that, from the outside perspective, never quite completes. The falling object appears to freeze, fainter and fainter, redder and redder, approaching the horizon forever without ever visibly arriving, at least as far as anyone watching from a safe distance could ever observe. From the perspective of whatever is actually falling, none of this feels like freezing at all. Their own local time continues to pass completely normally, at what feels to them like an ordinary rate. A second still feels like a second. Their heart still beats at what feels like its usual pace, right up until they cross the horizon, itself an unremarkable feeling boundary from the inside, and continue onward toward whatever ultimately awaits deeper within. The extreme time dilation is not something the falling observer experiences directly, in the sense of feeling time slow down around them. It is something that becomes visible only in comparison, in how their clock compares to a clock left far away, watching from a distance, for whom the falling object appears to take an eternity to complete a journey the falling object itself experiences as taking no unusual time at all. This is the same basic structure as the astronaut and his twin, the shelf clock and the floor clock, scaled up to its most extreme possible expression. Two observers in different gravitational conditions, disagreeing correctly, both of them, without either committing any error, about how much time a particular event took. The disagreement at a black hole's edge is not a difference of a fraction of a second. It approaches at the horizon itself, a difference that is mathematically infinite, an event that from one perspective takes a finite, ordinary amount of time and from another never finishes at all. Sit with that difference of scale for a moment because it clarifies something about everything discussed so far in this documentary. The gap between your clock and the clock of anyone you have ever loved has always been real, but vanishingly, almost immeasurably small, nowhere near the scale that would ever matter for anything in ordinary life. The black hole shows what happens when that same underlying mechanism, gravitational time dilation, is allowed to grow without the ordinary limits imposed by weak, everyday gravitational fields. It is not a different phenomenon. It is the identical phenomenon responsible for the tiny gap between a shelf clock and a floor clock, simply pushed to a scale where tiny becomes total. There is something worth taking from this contrast, beyond the sheer strangeness of it. The disagreement between the falling observer and the distant one at a black hole's edge is not a flaw in either observer's perspective. Both are correct simultaneously about how much time passed, because how much time passed was never a single, universal fact independent of where you happen to be standing and how strong the gravity was around you. This is the same lesson the earlier chapters tried to establish at a gentler scale, using rooftops and orbiting spacecraft rather than event horizons. There was never one true, correct answer to how much time had passed between two events, agreed upon by everyone, everywhere. There were only ever particular observers in particular conditions, each correctly measuring their own local portion of a structure that does not, itself, insist on a single shared answer. This raises a final, larger question worth addressing honestly before this documentary closes. If this effect is real at every scale, from a bookshelf to a black hole, is there any limit to how far apart two people's experienced time can actually drift, given enough distance, enough difference in gravity, enough difference in speed? And if there is no fundamental limit, what does that suggest about the nature of time itself, considered not at the scale of a single relationship, but at the scale of the whole universe? That is where we turn next. The universe's own mismatched clocks. There is a cosmic scale version of this same effect, and unlike the tiny gaps discussed at human scale, this one is large enough that astronomers have measured it directly, in the behavior of light arriving from galaxies so distant that the light left them billions of years ago. Distant galaxies are, on average, moving away from us as the universe itself expands, not moving through space in the ordinary sense, but carried apart by the expansion of space itself, a distinction subtle enough that it deserves its own careful treatment elsewhere, but one whose consequence is straightforward here. The greater the distance to a galaxy, generally speaking, the faster it appears to be receding. This recession does something specific and measurable to light and to time itself, as observed from here. Certain kinds of exploding stars, called supernovae, brighten and fade over a characteristic, well-understood timescale, a kind of natural clock, predictable enough that astronomers use it to measure distances across the universe. When astronomers observe these explosions in very distant galaxies, they find something that at first seems strange. The brightening and fading takes measurably longer, stretched out over more time, than the same kind of explosion observed in a nearby galaxy. The explosion itself is not actually happening more slowly, in any local sense, at the distant galaxy. What is happening is that the light carrying information about the explosion has been stretched by the expansion of space during its long journey to reach us, and that same stretching applies not just to the wavelength of the light, producing the familiar reddening called redshift, but to the timing of the events the light describes. This is in effect a form of time dilation, operating at a genuinely cosmic scale, produced not by speed or by a gravitational well in the sense discussed at black holes, but by the expansion of the universe itself, carrying the source of the light away from the observer over the vast span of time the light takes to arrive. A supernova that, from the perspective of anyone who happened to be standing nearby when it occurred, took a certain number of days to brighten and fade, appears from here after that light has traveled billions of years across an expanding universe, to have taken measurably longer, sometimes, for the most distant examples observed, more than twice as long. This measurement is worth pausing on, because it is one of the more direct confirmations available that the effects discussed throughout this documentary are not limited to laboratory clocks and orbiting spacecraft. They operate at every scale physics has ever been able to check, including the largest scales observable at all, in the behavior of light that began its journey before the Earth itself existed, arriving now, carrying with it a stretched, altered version of a timescale that unfolded locally in a completely ordinary way for whatever was actually present to witness that explosion up close. Consider what this means for the entire concept this documentary has been building around. That shared time has never been the simple, given, universal backdrop most people assume it to be. At the scale of a room, the gap between two clocks is too small to notice. At the scale of a black hole's edge, the gap becomes total, stretching an ordinary event into what looks from outside like an eternity. At the scale of the observable universe, the very fabric carrying light from one place to another stretches the timing of distant events measurably, permanently, as a simple consequence of how far that light had to travel and how much the universe expanded along the way. None of these are separate, unrelated phenomena. They are the same underlying fact about time, that its passage depends on the relationship between an observer and the specific physical conditions surrounding whatever they are observing, expressed at three wildly different scales: a shelf and a floor, a black hole's edge, and the entire visible universe. The astronaut returning very slightly younger than his twin, the falling object appearing frozen at a black hole's boundary, and a supernova billions of light years away appearing to unfold in slow motion, are at the deepest level the same story told at three different sizes. This brings the documentary back, finally, to the scale it actually began with, the room you are in right now, and the people who have shared it with you. Having looked at how far this effect can stretch, at both the smallest and largest scales physics has been able to measure, it is worth asking honestly what conclusion this documentary is actually entitled to draw from all of it, and where exactly careful science ends and something closer to interpretation, or simply a way of holding a hard fact gently, begins. Where careful science ends. It would be dishonest to let this documentary continue without pausing to separate, as clearly as possible, what has been established as settled physics from what is, at this point, an interpretation, a particular way of holding a settled fact, offered gently, but not itself a measured result the way the fact underneath it is. Here is what is not in question among physicists of any philosophical persuasion, working in any tradition anywhere. Gravitational time dilation is real, has been measured directly, repeatedly, with extraordinary precision, at scales ranging from a single foot of height difference in a laboratory to the orbit of GPS satellites to the edge of a black hole. Velocity-based time dilation is equally real, confirmed by clocks flown on aircraft, by particles accelerated to near light speed in laboratories, and by the measured aging difference of astronauts who have spent time in orbit. Cosmological time dilation, stretching the observed timescale of distant events due to the expansion of the universe, has been measured directly in the light curves of distant supernovae. None of this is contested. None of this depends on which interpretation of quantum mechanics you favor, or which side of any ongoing debate in the philosophy of physics you find more persuasive. These are measured facts, confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence, and treating them with anything less than full confidence would be its own kind of dishonesty. What is interpretation, offered carefully, honestly, and clearly labeled as such, is the emotional framework this documentary has built on top of those facts. The idea that ordinary human closeness constitutes an active, ongoing physical achievement of keeping two clocks near each other. The idea that grief might be gently reframed by understanding that the years of closeness you shared were not diminished by how they ended. The idea that an unremarkable evening spent near someone matters, physically, in the same basic way a milestone moment does. None of this is required by the physics. The physics does not care whether you find any of it meaningful, and it would remain exactly as true, exactly as measured, exactly as confirmed, whether or not anyone ever drew any emotional conclusion from it at all. This documentary has tried throughout to keep that boundary visible rather than blur it for effect. The measured facts are offered to you as facts because they are facts tested and confirmed as thoroughly as almost anything in physics has ever been tested. The emotional framework built on top of them is offered as one reasonable, carefully considered way of holding those facts, not the only way, and not a conclusion the physics itself insists upon. You are free to take the facts and set the framework aside entirely, keeping only the plain, remarkable truth that time does not pass at a single, fixed, universal rate, and that every clock you have ever stood near has been running at a rate very slightly its own. What can be said with full confidence, regardless of which emotional framework anyone chooses to build on top of it, is this: the version of shared time you have been intuitively assuming your whole life, a single, universal river carrying everyone forward together at exactly the same pace, is not the version the best available physics describes. Something stranger, more local, more individually determined is closer to the truth, confirmed not once but repeatedly, at scales from a bookshelf to a black hole to the edge of the observable universe. Having been honest about where the measured science ends, it is worth returning for the remainder of this documentary to what can still usefully be said about living inside a universe built this way, starting with a distinction worth making clearly: the difference between what a clock measures and what a body actually feels, what the body remembers that the clock does not. There is an important distinction this documentary has not yet made explicit, and making it clearly now will keep the rest of what follows from being misunderstood. The time dilation described throughout this documentary is a genuine physical effect on the actual passage of time itself, not merely on perception, not merely on how fast something feels. A clock that has experienced less gravitational time dilation has genuinely ticked through more actual time than one that has experienced more, and this applies in principle to every physical process, including the biological ones taking place inside a human body. Cell division, chemical reactions, the aging of tissue, all of it governed by the same underlying flow of time that governs any mechanical clock. And yet, for any ordinary human life, none of this biological difference could ever be detected. The gaps involved are so many orders of magnitude smaller than the natural variation in how quickly different human bodies age, depending on genetics, health, environment, sheer chance, that no doctor, no mirror, no measurement of your own body could ever reveal whether you had spent your life at a higher or lower altitude than someone else, or moving at a very slightly different average speed. The physical effect is real. Its visibility in an actual human life is not. This creates an interesting and worth naming asymmetry between two very different kinds of aging that get easily conflated. There is the aging a clock measures, the strict physical passage of time, governed exactly by the equations of relativity, real and precise down to fractions of a second, but for ordinary human lives essentially invisible. And there is the aging a body actually experiences and shows. Wrinkles, gray hair, the accumulated wear of a lived life, governed by biology, health, stress, environment, and a considerable amount of chance. A process orders of magnitude more variable, and orders of magnitude more visible than anything relativity has any meaningful influence over at ordinary human scales. It would be a mistake, and this documentary wants to be careful not to make it, to suggest that time dilation is secretly responsible for why one person looks older than another, or why two siblings age differently, or why grief sometimes seems to accelerate the visible signs of aging in a person who has suffered a great loss. None of that has anything to do with the physics discussed in this documentary. Biological aging is governed by an entirely different, much larger, much more variable set of causes, and conflating it with relativistic time dilation would trade a small, precise truth for a much larger, much less careful confusion. What relativity actually offers is something narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. Not an explanation for why people age differently in ways you can see, but a confirmation that even the most basic, seemingly fixed concept underlying all of that visible aging, the steady, uniform passage of time itself, was never quite as fixed and uniform as it appeared. The visible differences between how people age come from biology, environment, and chance. The invisible underlying differences in how much actual time each of them has lived through come from something else entirely. Their history of speed and gravity, a history so gentle for almost anyone who has ever lived an ordinary human life that it leaves no visible trace at all. This distinction matters for one final reason, worth carrying into the closing chapters of this documentary. Nothing said here is offering relativity as an explanation for the parts of aging, loss, and grief that are visible, painful, and immediate. Those have their own causes, and they deserve their own honest accounting, separate from anything measured in a physics laboratory. What this documentary has been offering throughout is something quieter, running underneath all of that. A confirmation that time itself, at the most fundamental level physics is able to describe, has never been the single, indifferent, uniform backdrop most people assume it to be, and that even the most ordinary act of staying near someone you love has, this entire time, been doing quiet, real, physical work that no mirror could ever show you, and no clock in an ordinary household could ever be precise enough to reveal. With that distinction in place, it is finally time to bring everything covered in this documentary together and ask plainly what it might actually mean to live well, knowing all of this. Learning to live out of sync. Here is where all of this actually lies once the numbers are set aside and only the shape of the idea remains. You are never going to be perfectly synchronized with anyone. Not with a parent, not with a partner, not with a child, not with your closest friend. That was never available to you, not because of any failure of closeness, but because perfect synchronization was never available to anyone anywhere, under any circumstances this universe allows. Two clocks brought as close together as two human bodies can physically get, still drift, however microscopically, however invisibly, for as long as they exist as two separate clocks at all. Most people spend a great deal of quiet, unexamined effort chasing a version of closeness that was never actually on offer. A complete, seamless merging of two lives into one uninterrupted shared present, any gap between them treated as a problem to be closed, a distance to be minimized, a failure of intimacy to be corrected. This documentary has tried to offer a different frame, built directly on measured physics rather than sentiment. The gap was never something closeness was supposed to eliminate. It was something closeness was always going to manage, kept small, kept close, kept near enough that it stopped mattering without ever actually reaching zero. There's a kind of relief available in that reframing if you let yourself take it. The relationships in your life were never failing to achieve some impossible standard of perfect unity. They were succeeding continuously at the only standard that was ever actually available, staying close enough for long enough that the inevitable, universal fact of separate clocks running at separate rates never became large enough to notice. Every year spent near someone you loved was a year spent meeting that standard fully, completely, exactly as well as it is possible for two separate human beings to meet it. This also offers a specific, practical way of thinking about the time you still have left with the people currently near you. If closeness is not a fixed state you either have or don't have, but an ongoing, active process of staying near, a process this documentary has shown operates identically, structurally, whether measured in the drift between two atomic clocks or the drift between two lives growing apart over years. Then it is also a process that can be actively continued, chosen again day by day, without needing to solve anything, fix anything, or achieve any kind of dramatic reconciliation. Staying close in the most literal physical sense this documentary has been describing throughout is simply a matter of remaining near. In space, in attention, in the ordinary shared rhythm of days spent within reach of each other. None of this is a solution to the parts of relationships that are genuinely difficult, the conflicts, the misunderstandings, the ordinary human friction that has nothing to do with gravitational fields or orbital velocity. This documentary has no interest in suggesting that physics can resolve what only patience, honesty, and effort between two people can actually resolve. What it offers instead is a quieter background reassurance running underneath whatever else is happening in a relationship. That the simple, unglamorous act of remaining near someone, sharing a meal, sitting in the same room, choosing proximity on an ordinary evening that doesn't feel significant at all, is not a lesser, secondary part of loving someone. It is at the deepest level physics is able to describe the actual mechanism of loving someone doing its quiet work, whether or not anyone in the room ever thinks about it in these terms at all. Somewhere in your life right now, there's very likely someone whose clock has been running close to yours for years, a parent, a partner, a friend, a sibling, close enough that the two of you have never noticed even the faintest disagreement about what time it is, or how much of your lives have passed. That closeness was never automatic, and it was never guaranteed to last. It has been maintained this entire time by nothing more dramatic than staying near, over and over, for years, without either of you ever needing to know the physics behind why it worked. Knowing the physics now does not change what to do next. It only changes how to understand what you have already, quietly, been doing all along. The slowest clock you will ever meet. Before this documentary closes, there is one more clock worth introducing, not a mechanical one, not a biological one, but the slowest, strangest timekeeping process known to exist, and one that puts everything discussed so far into a scale of its own. Deep inside the sun, in its core, nuclear fusion produces an enormous quantity of light in the form of high-energy photons. It seems reasonable to assume that this light, moving at the speed of light, would take only a few seconds to travel from the sun's core to its surface, a distance of a few 100,000 kilometers, before finally escaping into space and beginning the 8-minute journey to Earth that was mentioned earlier in this documentary. That assumption turns out to be dramatically wrong, and the reason why has nothing to do with relativity at all, though it pairs remarkably well with everything relativity has taught us about how differently time can behave depending on where you happen to be standing. The sun's interior is so extraordinarily dense that a photon produced at the core cannot simply travel in a straight line outward. It is absorbed and re-emitted, scattered in a random direction, absorbed again, re-emitted again, over and over, an almost unimaginable number of times in a process closer to a marble bouncing randomly through a dense crowd than to a beam of light traveling freely through space. Because each individual step of this process moves the photon only a tiny distance before it is absorbed again, and because the direction of each re-emission is essentially random, the photon's overall progress toward the surface is extraordinarily slow, despite every individual step happening at the speed of light. The result, calculated by physicists studying the structure of the sun, is staggering. A single photon produced in the sun's core can take anywhere from tens of thousands to well over 100,000 years to finally random walk its way out to the surface and escape into space, at which point it makes the familiar 8-minute journey to Earth in a straight, uninterrupted line. The light warming your skin on an ordinary afternoon may have begun its journey inside the sun's core before human beings had developed agriculture, before most of what we now consider human history had happened at all, not 8 minutes old at its true point of origin, but tens of thousands of years old, having spent nearly all of that time trapped, bouncing randomly inside a star. This is worth sitting with specifically because of how it complicates something this documentary asked you to consider at the very beginning, the idea of an 8-minute delay between the sun and the Earth. That delay is real, and it describes the final leg of the journey accurately. But it is only the very last chapter of a story that actually began tens of thousands of years earlier, inside a process so slow, so patient, so utterly unlike the everyday experience of light traveling in a straight line, that comparing it to ordinary human timescales barely makes sense at all. There is a specific, quiet strangeness in this that connects back to everything the rest of this documentary has been building. Every observer, every clock, every process in the universe experiences its own particular relationship to time, shaped by its own particular physical circumstances, speed, gravity, or in this case, the sheer density of the material it happens to be moving through. The sun's photons are not moving through a strong gravitational field, and they are not moving especially fast in any unusual sense. They move, as all light does, at exactly the speed of light. What slows their overall journey to a crawl, measured in tens of thousands of years, is simply the extraordinary density of the medium they have to cross, forcing an almost unimaginable number of individual detours before they finally break free. If a photon, the fastest thing in the universe, by definition, incapable of moving at anything other than the maximum possible speed at every single instant of its existence, can still end up taking tens of thousands of years to cross a few 100,000 kilometers, simply because of the conditions it happened to be moving through, it is worth reconsidering one final time. Any remaining intuition that time is a simple, straightforward thing, ticking along at some default, unmodified rate, interrupted only occasionally by unusual circumstances. There is no default rate. There has never been a default rate. Every journey through time, whether undertaken by a photon, a clock, an astronaut, or an ordinary human life, takes exactly as long as its specific physical circumstances require, no more, no less, and rarely anything close to what a naive assumption of uniform, universal time would predict. The light warming you on some future ordinary afternoon, the light you will feel without a second thought, will have already been 80,000 years or more in the making, arriving at your skin as the final, brief chapter of a journey that began before anything resembling your species existed. And this brings the documentary finally to its last question. Given everything this slow, strange, unevenly flowing universe has revealed, what is the actual difference between distance and absence, and which one, honestly, is the one you have been grieving? The difference between distance and absence. There's a question worth asking plainly, now that every piece of the physics has been laid out carefully. What exactly has this documentary been arguing you should feel differently about? Not the facts themselves, those stand on their own, measured and confirmed, regardless of how anyone chooses to feel about them. The question is what to do with the emotional weight that tends to gather around the idea of time passing differently for different people, especially once it touches on loss. Here is an attempt at a precise answer, built from everything covered so far. Distance, in the sense this documentary has been using the word, is a gap between two clocks, a real, physical, measurable difference in elapsed time, produced by speed or gravity, or the density of whatever medium separates two observers. Absence is something different. The complete cessation of one of those two clocks, the end of its ongoing accumulation of new moments entirely. These are not the same thing, and conflating them is where a great deal of unnecessary additional pain tends to get layered onto losses that are already difficult enough without it. Ordinary separation, distance in the first sense, is something this documentary has shown to be universal, constant, and almost entirely harmless in scale. You have always been at some non-zero distance in this technical sense from everyone you have ever known, and that distance has never meaningfully interfered with the closeness those relationships actually provided. Distance of this kind is not something to fear or grieve or treat as evidence of anything having gone wrong. It is simply the ordinary, universal condition of being two separate physical observers in a universe that does not permit perfect synchronization between any two of them. Absence, the end of a clock's ongoing accumulation of moments, is a genuinely different kind of event, and this documentary has never suggested otherwise. It is not softened, resolved, or made smaller by anything discussed in the previous chapters. What has been offered instead is a way of keeping absence from unnecessarily borrowing the full emotional weight that distance never actually deserved in the first place. If you have ever felt that ordinary time apart from someone was itself a kind of small loss, a fraying, a drifting, a failure to stay perfectly united, this documentary hopes to have shown that this particular fear was never physically justified. Ordinary distance was never a threat to closeness. It was simply the background condition closeness has always operated within successfully for as long as any two people have ever managed to stay near each other. What remains once that unnecessary fear is set aside is the real, difficult, unavoidable weight of actual absence, the specific losses in your life that are not simply distance, but genuine endings. This documentary has not tried to diminish that weight and will not attempt to in these final moments either. What it has tried to offer throughout is a way of understanding that the years of closeness which preceded any particular absence were not undermined retroactively by how they ended. They were real. They were, by the actual physical standard this documentary has spent its entire runtime establishing, about as close as two separate clocks in this universe are ever able to get. That fact does not resolve grief. It simply refuses to let grief claim more territory than it is actually owed, refuses to let the ordinary, harmless, universal fact of separate clocks get quietly folded into the genuine, singular fact of an ending. If there is a single sentence this documentary would want you to carry out of this into an ordinary day, it is this: the distance between you and the people you love has never been the enemy of your closeness with them. It has simply been the space closeness has always had to work within, successfully, quietly the entire time, right up until, for some of those people, it became something else entirely. Knowing the difference between those two things will not make the second one hurt less. But it might stop the first one from adding weight that was never actually there to begin with. That is most of what this documentary has to offer. What remains is simply to let it settle, the way anything heard carefully in the dark tends to settle slowly over the course of whatever is left of tonight. 2 clocks, 1 bed. Picture, to close this out, something as ordinary as possible: 2 people lying in the dark in the same bed at the end of an unremarkable day. Neither of them is thinking about physics. Neither of them has any reason to. And yet in that room right now, something precise and measurable is quietly true, whether or not either of them will ever know it. Their 2 bodies, at very slightly different heights above the mattress, moving very slightly differently as they breathe, are experiencing the passage of time at rates that differ from each other by an amount too small for any device outside a physics laboratory to ever detect, and yet not 0. 2 clocks, not 1, never 1. Simply close enough that the difference has never mattered and never will for anything either of them will ever need to measure. This is, in the end, the entire idea this documentary has been trying to leave you with, reduced to its smallest, most concrete form. Not a grand cosmic claim about the nature of the universe, though the physics behind it reaches all the way out to black holes and the edge of the observable universe. A small, quiet, almost domestic fact: the people closest to you have never actually been perfectly synchronized with you, and it never mattered because closeness was never about synchronization in the first place. It was about staying near enough for long enough that the difference disappeared into irrelevance, which is, when you look closely enough at what physics actually requires, the only kind of togetherness that has ever existed for anyone, anywhere, in the entire history of the universe. There is no dramatic action this asks of you. It does not ask you to measure anything, or worry about anything, or change how you spend an ordinary evening with someone you love. It asks only for a small, quiet adjustment in how you understand what that evening already was all along. Not a shared, seamless present moving identically through 2 people at once, but 2 separate, ongoing, individually ticking lives, choosing again and again, without needing to know why it worked, to stay close enough to each other that the gap between them never grew large enough to feel like distance at all. If you take one thing from this into tomorrow, let it be this: the closeness you have built with the people in your life has never been a given, automatic fact of proximity. It has been an achievement, small and constant and almost entirely unnoticed, repeated every single day you chose to stay near someone rather than drift away, physically true. In a sense, the equations of general relativity are able to confirm precisely, and physically true in the older, gentler sense that has nothing to do with equations at all. Two clocks in one bed in one ordinary room kept close for one more day. That is what closeness has always actually been. It was never less than that. It was never going to be more before you sleep. If you are still here, still listening, the day is well behind you now, and this is the part of the documentary that isn't really about new information anymore. It's about letting everything already said settle into something you can actually carry into sleep. Think of someone specific, not everyone you have ever loved, just one person, whoever came to mind first while any of this was playing. Think of the last ordinary time you were near them, not a special occasion, just an evening, a car ride, a quiet meal, nothing anyone would have thought to remember on purpose. That moment did exactly what this documentary has spent its entire runtime describing. It kept two separate clocks close together for a little while longer, doing the quiet physical work of closeness without either of you noticing it was work at all. You cannot get that specific evening back. That much has never been in question, and nothing in this documentary has tried to suggest otherwise. What you can hold on to instead is the more precise, more durable fact underneath it, that the evening counted fully exactly as much as any more significant moment would have, because closeness was never measured in significance. It was measured in nearness, and for as long as that evening lasted, nearness is exactly what you had. If there is someone in your life right now whose clock is still, tonight, running close to yours, under the same roof, in the same city, a phone call away, there is nothing dramatic this documentary is asking you to do about that fact before you fall asleep. No message that needs sending tonight, no conversation that needs having right this moment. Only perhaps a slightly different way of noticing tomorrow's ordinary, unremarkable time near them when it comes. Not as filler, not as the quiet space between the moments that matter, but as the actual mechanism, the real physical event of staying close to someone in a universe that never guaranteed you'd be able to. And if there is someone whose clock has already stopped, whose ongoing accumulation of new moments ended before you were ready for it to, let this be the last thing this documentary offers you about that, stated as plainly as it can be stated. The years you spent near them were real. Not real in some qualified, sentimental, everything happens for a reason sense, but real in the specific, physical, measurable sense this entire documentary has been describing. Two clocks kept close for as long as closeness lasted, achieving exactly what closeness has ever been able to achieve for any two people in the history of this universe. Nothing about how it ended changes what it was while it was happening. Physics does not allow that kind of revision. What happened happened and stays true permanently at its own place in both of your histories, regardless of anything that came after. Let the room stay dark and quiet a little longer. There is nothing left to understand tonight that hasn't already been said. Whatever closeness you have built with whoever is still near enough to build it with was never less real for being ordinary and was never diminished by the plain, universal fact that no two clocks in this entire universe have ever run in perfect, permanent unison. Yours didn't either. It was never going to, and it was enough anyway. Rest if you can. Tomorrow, the clocks nearest to you will still be running close, exactly as they have been, doing their quiet work whether or not you remember tonight that they ever needed to. One last number. Before this documentary lets you go, there is one more number worth sitting with, because it answers a question that has probably been quietly forming somewhere in the back of your mind throughout all of this. How far apart, or how differently, would two people actually have to live for this effect to become large enough to notice without a physics laboratory? Consider two people born on the same day, one of whom spends their entire life at sea level, and the other who spends their entire life at the cruising altitude of a commercial jet, roughly 10 kilometers up, not realistic for an actual human life, but useful as a clean, extreme comparison. Across 80 years, the gravitational time dilation between those two altitudes would produce a difference in elapsed time of only a few dozen microseconds, spread out over 8 full decades. A few dozen millionths of a second in total, for an entire lifetime spent at a genuinely extreme, sustained difference in altitude. That is how small this effect actually is, even pushed to a boundary condition that no ordinary human life would ever approach. To get a difference large enough to notice with an unaided human sense of time, a difference of, say, a full second, two observers would need to sustain a difference in gravitational potential, or in relative speed, so extreme that it moves well outside anything the human body or currently existing human technology could survive or achieve for any meaningful duration. You would need speeds approaching a significant fraction of the speed of light, sustained for months or years, or gravitational fields many orders of magnitude stronger than anything found on the surface of the Earth. Nothing in ordinary human experience across the entire history of the species has ever come close to producing a time dilation gap large enough for any person to notice directly without instruments built for the specific purpose of detecting it. This number is worth holding onto for a very specific reason. It draws a firm, honest boundary around everything discussed in this documentary. This is not a documentary about a hidden force secretly separating people you love at a scale that matters without your knowledge. It never was. The gaps are real, confirmed, measured, and for any life you or anyone you know will ever live, functionally, permanently invisible. If this documentary has left you with any anxiety about the actual, felt closeness of your relationships, that anxiety is not warranted by the physics, and it was never the intention here. To put the scale in perspective one final way, if you added together every microsecond of time dilation accumulated across an entire ordinary human lifetime, spent moving through cities, taking the occasional flight, living at whatever elevation you happen to call home, the total would still be smaller than the time it takes you to blink. An entire life's worth of drift, smaller than a single blink. That is the true size of the gap this documentary has spent so long describing, vanishingly small, and yet, as every chapter has tried to show, never quite nothing. What the number is actually good for is something different, a precise, quantified reminder of just how effective ordinary human closeness already is physically at achieving what it has always seemed intuitively to achieve. You never needed to think about gravitational time dilation to stay close to the people you love, and you never will. The physics was always operating quietly in the background, confirming at a level far beneath anything you could ever perceive, that the closeness you built through nothing more complicated than staying near someone was, this entire time, doing exactly what closeness was supposed to do. Perhaps that is the most honest way to close this out. This documentary spent its entire runtime walking you through one of the strangest, best confirmed facts in all of physics. That time itself does not pass at a single, fixed, universal rate, and that this is true for you and everyone you have ever known right now, without exception. And having walked through the black holes, the orbiting spacecraft, the sun's ancient, wandering light, and the deep unresolved edges of interpretation where careful physicists still disagree, it arrives finally at a number small enough to fit inside a single ordinary evening, too small to ever notice, and yet never quite zero, which turns out to be exactly the right way to describe what closeness with another person has always actually been. A final thought small enough to carry into sleep. Somewhere above you tonight, whether or not clouds happen to be hiding it, satellites are quietly correcting their onboard clocks for exactly the effect this documentary has spent its runtime describing: a small, constant, engineered acknowledgement built into the infrastructure of the modern world that time does not pass the same way everywhere. Nobody riding in a car following that satellite's directions ever thinks about it. The correction happens anyway, silently, keeping the whole system close enough to accurate that the difference never has to be noticed by anyone on the ground. That is not a bad way to think about closeness with another person either. It rarely announces itself. It rarely asks to be noticed or measured or thanked for functioning correctly. It simply keeps working quietly underneath an ordinary day, correcting for whatever small drift accumulates, so that everything above it, the relationship, the routine, the shared life, continues to feel from the inside like a single, seamless thing, even though it was never technically exactly that. Let that be enough for tonight. You do not need to remember the numbers or the black holes or the sun's ancient light for any of this to keep quietly being true. You only needed to hear it once in the dark for it to change slightly the weight some of these words have carried for you until now, together, near, close, apart, gone. None of them ever meant quite what you assumed. All of them, it turns out, were always talking about clocks, yours and everyone else's, running near each other for as long as nearness lasted and staying real permanently however the distance between them eventually changed. Good night. Wherever the nearest clock to yours happens to be tonight, it is still running, close enough, exactly as it has been. That is all closeness has ever actually required, and it has been enough this whole time. The clock inside every atom. There is one more layer worth adding before this documentary truly closes, because it touches something even more basic than anything discussed so far. What a second actually is in the first place. For most of human history, a second was defined in terms of the Earth's rotation and orbit, a fixed fraction of a day, itself a fixed fraction of a year, tied to the motion of the planet you happen to live on. This definition was intuitive, useful, and it eventually turned out not nearly precise or stable enough for modern science, since the Earth's rotation itself varies slightly over time, in ways too irregular to serve as a truly reliable standard. The modern definition of a second has nothing to do with the Earth at all. It is defined by counting a specific, extraordinarily consistent number of oscillations of radiation emitted by a cesium atom, transitioning between two particular energy states. This number was chosen specifically because it is repeatable, universal, and stable to a degree the rotation of a planet could never match. A cesium atom here behaves, as far as anyone has ever been able to measure, identically to a cesium atom anywhere else in the universe, oscillating at precisely the same fundamental rate, regardless of where that atom happens to be. And yet, and this is the layer worth sitting with, even this atomic definition of a second is not immune to everything discussed throughout this documentary. A cesium atom's oscillation rate is fixed relative to its own local conditions, but two cesium clocks, one on a mountaintop and one at sea level, one on the ground and one aboard an orbiting satellite, will still measure a different number of seconds elapsing between the same two events for exactly the reasons covered in earlier chapters. The atom itself is not malfunctioning, and its internal oscillation rate has not changed. What has changed is the relationship between that atom's local flow of time and the flow of time experienced by an observer somewhere else, in different gravitational or motional conditions. This means that even the most fundamental, most carefully defined unit of time human beings have ever constructed, the very definition of a second, built from something as reliable as the oscillation of a single kind of atom, does not describe a single, universal rate shared by the whole universe. It describes a local rate, accurate and meaningful for whatever cesium atom happens to be doing the counting, in whatever specific conditions that atom happens to be sitting in. There is no atom anywhere, no oscillation anywhere, no process of any kind that ticks at a rate the entire universe has agreed to treat as the single correct standard, independent of location and motion. This is, in a way, the most concentrated version of everything this documentary has tried to say. Even stripped down to its most basic, most carefully engineered unit, a single number counted from a single kind of atom, chosen specifically for its universality, time still refuses to offer a single, fixed, shared rate. The most precise clock human beings have ever built still only tells you the local time, for wherever that particular clock happens to be standing, doing wherever that particular clock happens to be doing, and nothing more universal than that. Perhaps that is the right note to end the science on. Time was never going to give you a single shared answer, no matter how precisely you tried to define it, or how carefully you tried to measure it, or how far you were willing to travel in pursuit of a truly universal clock. What it offers instead, at every scale this documentary has explored: a bookshelf, an orbiting spacecraft, the edge of a black hole, the light of a supernova billions of years old, and now the smallest, most carefully engineered oscillation of a single atom is something more modest, and in its own way more remarkable. Countless separate, local, entirely real flows of time, each one valid, each one true, each one belonging to whatever observer or object or atom happens to be experiencing it, all of them running close enough to each other, most of the time, for the difference to disappear into the comfortable, ordinary illusion of a single shared present. It was never quite that, but it was always close enough. And for as long as you have had people near you keeping their clocks close to yours, that has always been more than enough. The twin who stayed. There is a detail about the cosmonaut mentioned earlier in this documentary worth returning to, one that rarely gets included when this story is told as a simple demonstration of relativity. He was not actually a twin in the strict sense used by the thought experiment that shares its name. But there were, in a broader sense, plenty of people who stayed behind while he orbited: colleagues, family, an entire ground crew whose clocks continued running at the ordinary, undisturbed rate of anyone standing on the surface of the earth, while his ran very slightly slower, high above them, moving at extraordinary speed. Consider for a moment what that means from their side of the story rather than his. While he experienced months that felt, to him, like an entirely ordinary passage of time, meals, sleep, work, the everyday rhythm of a life lived in orbit, the people below him were living through those same months at their own, very slightly different rate, unaware in any way they could perceive that a real, measurable gap was quietly opening between their clock and his. When he returned and the instruments confirmed the tiny, precise difference the equations had predicted, nobody on the ground felt any different for it. Nobody needed to. The difference was too small to matter to any of them in any practical sense, and their relationship with him, as colleagues, as family, as people who had missed him, was not altered in any way by a gap of a fraction of a second. This detail matters because it is the clearest, most literal illustration this documentary has to offer of everything argued in the chapters before it. The people who stayed on the ground did not fail to stay close to him during his absence. Distance in the physical sense this documentary has spent its entire runtime describing, opened up between them regardless, an unavoidable consequence of him moving fast, far above the earth, while they remained still near the surface. And yet the closeness that mattered, the relationships, the reunion, the simple fact of missing someone and then no longer having to, was untouched by any of it. The tiny, real, measured gap and the full, undiminished closeness of the people who welcomed him home existed simultaneously, without contradiction, because they were never actually competing for the same kind of significance. That is, in miniature, the entire argument this documentary has tried to make. Real physical distance, exactly as small as it always turns out to be, and real, undiminished human closeness can exist at the very same time, describing the very same relationship, without one threatening the other in any way at all. What the calendar never actually measured. There's a small, practical irony worth naming before this documentary's final chapters, because it ties together the personal and the cosmic in a way that deserves its own moment. Every calendar you have ever used, every birthday you have ever celebrated, every anniversary marked on a specific date was built entirely around the motion of the Earth, its rotation defining a day and its orbit around the Sun defining a year. These are useful, even beautiful, units for coordinating human life. They are not, and were never intended to be, precise measurements of the actual physical time experienced by any individual body. This means that when you say you have known someone for 10 years, what you are actually reporting is that the Earth has completed 10 orbits of the Sun since a particular starting point, a fact about the planet's motion, agreed upon by convention, useful for coordinating birthdays and anniversaries and every other social marker of shared history. It was never a claim about how much actual physical time either of you individually experienced during that span. Down to the level of precision this documentary has been describing. Two people who have known each other 10 years, by the calendar, have not necessarily experienced identical amounts of physical time during that decade, not if one of them spent it flying frequently, or living at a different elevation, or spending months in a place with meaningfully different gravity. For any ordinary life, this distinction changes nothing practical. Nobody needs to recalculate a friendship's anniversary based on how many transatlantic flights either party took. But it is worth knowing that the number on the calendar was always a convenient fiction, a shared agreement useful for coordination, layered on top of a much stranger, much more individual reality, one where every single person carries their own particular, slightly unique history of elapsed time, built from wherever they happen to stand and however fast they happen to move for their entire life. There's something almost freeing in recognizing that the numbers marking a relationship's length were never quite as precise as they felt. A friendship of 10 calendar years is not diminished by the fact that its true physical duration, for each of you individually, differed by some infinitesimal amount neither of you will ever know or need to know. If anything, it is a reminder that the meaning of those 10 years was never really located in the precision of the number at all. It was located in what happened during them, how close you stayed, how many ordinary evenings you spent within reach of each other, how many separate clocks you kept quietly, patiently synchronized, one unremarkable day at a time. This is worth extending one step further because it touches something almost nobody thinks to question. When you tell someone your age, you are reporting a count of the Earth's orbits, not a direct measurement of your own body's accumulated physical time. Two people born on exactly the same calendar date who have lived in different places at different elevations with different patterns of travel are not, in the strictest physical sense, exactly the same age, even though every document either of them owns would insist otherwise. The gap is so small it will never matter to anyone, but it is a genuine physical fact rather than a rounding error. One more quiet reminder that even the most basic personal facts you have always taken for granted, the ones stamped on official documents and repeated at every birthday, were built from a convenient planetary convention rather than a precise account of your own particular individual passage through time. Why closeness has a speed limit. There is one last scientific idea worth adding, because it explains something this documentary has assumed without ever stating directly: why none of these gaps, however small, can ever be closed completely, no matter how close two people try to stay. The speed of light is not simply the fastest speed anything happens to travel at. It is, according to everything relativity has taught physicists over the past century, the fastest speed at which any influence, any signal, any effect of any kind can travel between 2 points in the universe. Nothing, no force, no information, no cause reaching toward its effect can cross space faster than light does. This is not a limitation of current technology, waiting to be engineered around with a sufficiently clever invention. It is built into the structure of spacetime itself, the same structure responsible for every form of time dilation covered throughout this documentary. This speed limit has a quiet consequence for closeness that is worth naming plainly. Even if two people stood as physically close together as matter allows, closer than any two people have ever actually stood, there would still be a non-zero amount of time required for anything happening in one of their bodies to have any possible effect on the other. A neuron firing in your brain, prompting a word, a glance, a touch, takes a small but real amount of time to become something the other person can perceive and respond to. That delay is vastly smaller than anything human perception could ever register, but it is not zero, for the same fundamental reason that the far larger delays discussed throughout this documentary are never zero either. Nothing in this universe connects two separate points instantly. Every connection, however close, however loving, however immediate it feels, is mediated by a signal traveling at a finite maximum speed, taking some finite, non-zero amount of time to arrive. It is worth being precise about why this speed limit exists at all, rather than simply accepting it as an arbitrary rule. It falls directly out of the same structure of spacetime responsible for everything else covered in this documentary, the same structure that makes simultaneity relative, that lets gravity slow clocks, that produces the light cones separating what can and cannot causally influence a given event. The speed of light is not a special exception layered on top of that structure. It is the structure's own built-in boundary, the one universal speed every observer, regardless of their own motion, measures as exactly the same value, the single fixed point the entire rest of the framework is built around. This is, in its own way, a variation on everything already said, arriving from a different direction. Perfect instantaneous connection between two separate observers was never physically available, not because of any failure of closeness, but because the very fabric connecting 2 points in space refuses to transmit anything instantly, no matter how close those 2 points happen to be. What closeness has always actually achieved, then, was never the elimination of this gap. It was the shrinking of it again and again to a size so small that no human being in the entire history of the species has ever had any reason to notice it was there at all. There is something almost comforting in learning that even the universe's fastest possible connection still isn't instant. It means the small, ordinary gap you have never noticed between yourself and anyone you have ever loved was never a personal shortcoming, a failure of intimacy, or a sign that something wasn't quite close enough. It was and remains a basic structural feature of the universe itself, present in every relationship that has ever existed, present between every pair of atoms that have ever interacted, present in the space between this sentence and your understanding of it. Closeness was never about closing that gap completely. Nothing in this universe has ever managed that for any two things at any scale. Closeness was always about getting near enough that the gap simply stopped mattering, which, as this documentary has tried to show again and again, at every scale from a shelf to a black hole to the light still traveling out from the sun's ancient core, has always been more than enough. It is worth adding one final, honest caveat here, in keeping with the care this documentary has tried to take throughout. Physicists continue to study whether this speed limit holds under every conceivable condition, including some genuinely strange, still theoretical scenarios involving the deep structure of spacetime that remain far from settled. Nothing currently confirmed suggests any practical exception exists, and nothing in this documentary has relied on any exception existing. But intellectual honesty means acknowledging, one more time before this closes, that even a boundary as fundamental as the speed of light sits inside a larger scientific project that is not yet, and may never be, entirely finished, before you truly sleep. This is the last of it. Whatever room you are in, whatever hour this has found you at, there is nothing more this documentary needs from you except permission to let it go quiet now. You came into this carrying, perhaps without naming it, some version of the old assumption that shared time was a single thing, a given, a river everyone floats down together at the same unbroken pace. That assumption is not how the universe actually works, and by now, hopefully, that no longer feels like an abstract fact about physics, but something closer to a felt, settled understanding. Every clock near you tonight, every heartbeat, every breath, every quiet tick of an ordinary house at rest has been running at its own particular rate, close enough to yours that none of it has ever needed to be noticed, and real enough that none of it was ever wasted. There is a small, specific image worth carrying out of this and into sleep, if any single one of them has to be chosen. Not the black hole, freezing whatever falls toward it at the edge of forever. Not the astronaut, coming home younger by a fraction of a second nobody could ever feel. Just an ordinary room tonight, wherever you happen to be, and somewhere nearby, or somewhere farther than you'd like, a person whose clock has spent years quietly, patiently, staying close to yours, doing work neither of you ever had to think about in order for it to count. That work does not stop simply because you fall asleep before finishing this sentence. It does not require your attention to keep functioning, any more than a satellite's onboard correction requires the driver below to understand the mathematics behind it. It simply continues tonight and tomorrow, and for as long as nearness is chosen again and again, in the small, unremarkable ways that were never going to announce themselves as significant while they were happening. Let the room stay dark. Let whatever you came in carrying stay set down, at least for tonight. The clocks nearest to you, whoever and wherever they are still running close exactly as they should be. That was always the whole entire point. Sleep now if you're ready. Everything here will still be true when you wake, running quietly close by, exactly where you left it. One closing note on all of this before the room finally goes quiet. Nothing in this documentary was ever meant to replace the ordinary, unscientific ways people already have of talking about closeness, distance, and loss. Physics does not need to be consulted before you miss someone, or hold someone, or grieve someone. It was offered here only as a second, quieter language running underneath the familiar one built from measured, tested, carefully confirmed facts rather than metaphor, that happens almost unexpectedly to agree with what the older language was already trying to say. That nearness matters, that time apart is real but rarely as costly as it feels, and that nothing genuinely shared is ever fully taken back by whatever comes after it. That is the whole of it. Two languages, one older and felt, one newer and measured, arriving from very different directions at roughly the same quiet place. Good night. Whatever clock is running nearest to yours tonight, it is close enough, and it always was. If nothing else survives the night from everything said here, let it be that single image. An entire lifetime's worth of separation from everyone you have ever loved, added up completely, still smaller than a blink. Whatever distance you have ever felt from the people closest to you, the universe itself was never the source of it. It was always, underneath everything else, remarkably, reliably on the side of staying close. Rest now. Nothing about tonight needs to be measured, only lived, close to whatever clocks are still nearby. That is the end of it. Not a resolution, not a final proof, just a long, careful look at something true, offered gently enough, hopefully, to carry with you into sleep rather than away from it. Whatever you set down tonight, the physics behind it will still be exactly this true tomorrow and the night after, for as long as you ever need it to be. Sleep well. Whatever hour this finds you at, wherever the nearest clock to yours happens to be tonight, let it be enough one more time that it is close. Nothing further needs to be added to that. Nothing further